Sometimes a single moment changes everything. For Elena, it was the moment a stranger refused to look away. For Caleb Hart, it was the moment he heard a man call a woman his property. He'd ridden into Redemption Flats looking for nothing, a ghost drifting through the post-war Texas dust. But when he saw Baron Whitmore's boot connect with Elena's shoulder, something inside him, something he thought the war had killed, woke up. Whitmore was a big man, but soft. His power came from money and fear, not strength. Caleb was different. He was tall, broad, and carried the quiet stillness of a man who'd seen the worst of the world and survived. He'd been sitting on the boarding house porch, nursing a coffee, when the scene unfolded across the street. Elena, a woman who moved with a grace that defied her simple clothes, had dropped her basket. And Whitmore, her master, was making her pay for it. He snarled something about her being a clumsy witch, his voice loud enough for the whole town to hear. And then Caleb saw it. A glint of silver in the dust. A small cross, torn from a necklace. Elena reached for it, her hand desperate. But Whitmore's boot came down again, this time on her wrist. A sharp crack echoed in the morning air. And something inside Caleb snapped. He was across the street before he even realized he was moving. The townsfolk who had been watching from a distance suddenly found their shoes very interesting. They knew what was coming. "Problem here?" Caleb's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. Whitmore looked up, his face red with drink and rage. He saw a stranger, a man who didn't know the rules in this town. "No problem that concerns you, friend," Whitmore sneered. "Just disciplining my property." There it was, that word, property. As if she were a horse or a chair. Caleb's hand drifted toward the Colt at his hip, an old, familiar habit, but he stopped himself. Drawing a gun would only get Elena hurt worse. Instead, he looked past the Baron, directly at Elena. Her eyes met his. In them, he saw a universe of pain, fear, and something else he hadn't expected, a flicker of hope so fierce it almost burned him. "Ma'am," Caleb said, his voice gentle, "are you all right?" Before she could answer, Whitmore stepped between them. "She belongs to me. This is my land. You'd do well to move along before you get hurt." But Caleb wasn't looking at Whitmore anymore. He was looking at the silver cross in the dust. He knelt down, picked it up, and brushed it clean with his thumb. He held it out to Elena. For a second, no one moved. It was a simple gesture, but everyone on that street understood what it meant. He wasn't just giving her back a piece of jewelry. He was giving her back a piece of herself. He was telling her, and the whole town, that she was a human being. Elena reached for it, tears welling in her eyes. But Whitmore was faster. He snatched the cross from Caleb's hand. "That's mine now," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Everything she has is mine." That was the final mistake. Caleb's hand shot out, not for his gun, but for Whitmore's wrist. His grip was like iron. He squeezed, just enough. Whitmore's eyes widened, a flicker of fear replacing the anger. "Nobody owns her," Caleb said, his voice still quiet, but now it held the promise of violence. "The war's over. Nobody owns anybody." Whitmore tried to pull away, but it was like trying to pull free from a bear trap. "She's bound by debt," he gasped. "Legal and proper. Her family owed me money." It was a lie. Caleb saw it in his eyes, saw it in the way Elena flinched at the mention of her family. But it was the kind of lie that worked in towns like this. The kind of lie that turned people into property. "How much?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously calm. Whitmore saw an out. $7,000. It was a fortune, an impossible sum, but Caleb just nodded. "I'll buy her contract." The words hung in the air. Whitmore laughed, a short, ugly sound. You don't have that kind of money. Maybe not, Caleb said, releasing the Baron's wrist. But I know where to get it. He gave Whitmore a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was the look he'd given men on the battlefield right before the end. I think we'll come to an arrangement, he said softly. One way or another. He turned and walked away, leaving Whitmore sputtering, the stolen cross clutched in his sweaty hand. Caleb didn't look back, but he could feel Elena's eyes on him. He had just declared war on the most powerful man in town, all for a woman he didn't even know. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have the money. All he had was a promise he'd made to himself, a promise to balance the scales for the things he'd done in the war. And looking at that big house where Elena was a prisoner, he knew his own redemption had just begun. He had to get her out. Not tomorrow. Tonight. The town of Redemption Flats went to sleep early. Fear had a way of making people lock their doors and blow out their lamps as soon as the sun went down. But Caleb Hart was a creature of the dark. The war had taught him how to move through shadows like a ghost, how to listen to the language of the night. He'd spent the evening at the saloon, not drinking, but listening. He learned that Elena's family had owned a huge ranch before the war, that they'd been respected. He learned that they'd died in a mysterious fire right after a dispute with Whitmore over water rights. And he learned that Whitmore had graciously taken in the orphaned Elena to work off a debt no one had ever seen proof of. It was an old story, one he'd heard a dozen times. A story of greed and power, written in the blood of the innocent. By midnight, he knew everything he needed to know. He slipped out the back of the boarding house and made his way toward the Baron's mansion. The house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in an upstairs window. Whitmore's room. A rhythmic, ugly snoring drifted out into the night. Caleb moved to the back of the house, to the servants' entrance. The lock was old, simple. It took him less than 30 seconds. He was inside. The house smelled of stale whiskey and fear. He followed a narrow hallway to a small room at the very back, barely bigger than a closet. Elena was there, sitting on the edge of her cot, fully dressed. She wasn't surprised to see him. It was as if she'd been waiting. "You should not be here," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the dark. "Neither should you," he whispered back. In the sliver of moonlight from the tiny window, he could see the fresh bruises on her face, the way she cradled her injured wrist. "He hurt you again, because of me." She shook her head. "He hurt me because he is a monster. You just gave him a new excuse." "I'm getting you out of here," Caleb said, his voice firm. "And then what?" Her question was practical, devoid of panic. She was a survivor. She knew the odds. "He owns everything for 100 miles. There is nowhere to run." "I have a ranch in Colorado," he said. "My uncle left it to me. We can go there. You'll be safe. You'll be free." The word hung in the air between them. Free. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She wasn't just seeing a savior, she was seeing a man as haunted as she was. "Why?" she asked. "You owe me nothing." He knelt in front of her, so their eyes were level. "Maybe I'm the one who needs saving," he said, his voice rough with honesty. He told her about the war, about the things he'd done, the bridges he'd burned, the lives he'd taken. "These hands," he said, holding them up in the moonlight. "They've only ever known how to destroy. Maybe it's time they built something. Maybe it's time they saved someone." Elena reached out and her fingers brushed against his. The touch was like lightning, a spark of life in the dead of night. For a long moment, they just stayed like that, two broken souls finding a strange comfort in the darkness. Then she pulled her hand away. "If we leave," she said, her voice dropping even lower, "he will send men. They will hunt us." "Let them," Caleb said. "I know how to fight, and I know how to run." Elena nodded slowly. a decision was made. She stood and gathered a small bundle of belongings, a worn Bible, a faded photograph, a few pieces of simple jewelry. As she turned to face him, her eyes were hard. "There is one more thing," she said. "If we are caught, you must promise me. Promise you won't let him take me back alive." The request hit him harder than any bullet. She would rather die than return to this prison. He saw the cold, hard truth of it in her eyes. This wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a command. "I promise," he said, his voice a vow. "But it won't come to that. I will get you out of here. I will get you free." They slipped out of the house and into the night, but they didn't head for the livery stable. Caleb had a better idea. They went to Whitmore's own stable, where he kept his finest horses. They took two of them, the fastest and the strongest. It was a small piece of justice, a down payment on the debt Whitmore owed her. As they rode out of Redemption Flats, with the town sleeping behind them and a vast, dangerous wilderness ahead, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was a chance. And as the hooves of Whitmore's own horse ate up the miles, a small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in a very long time. The chase had begun. The Texas landscape was a harsh, unforgiving place. But for Elena, it was home. She knew its secrets, its hidden trails, its secret springs. She rode not like a fugitive, but like a queen returning to her kingdom. Caleb followed her lead, amazed at her skill, her intimate knowledge of the land that had been stolen from her. "My father taught me to read the land before I could read books," she told him as they paused to water the horses at a hidden creek. "He said a person who understands the country they live in can never be truly lost." She told him the whole story then, the story of her family, of their ranch, of the way Whitmore had slowly, systematically squeezed them out. It started with legal tricks, forged documents, and bribed judges. When that didn't work, it escalated. Her older brother Miguel had tried to fight back. He and his friends had been ambushed and killed. That same night, the ranch house burned to the ground with her parents inside. Whitmore had orchestrated it all, a patient, ruthless campaign of destruction. And then he'd played the part of the savior, taking in the lone survivor, trapping her in a web of fabricated debt and constant terror. Listening to her story, Caleb felt a cold fury settle in his gut. This wasn't just about freeing a woman from a cruel master anymore. This was about vengeance. This was about justice. They rode hard for 2 days, pushing north, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and Whitmore's rage. But on the 3rd morning, Elena reined in her horse, her head tilted, listening. Caleb couldn't hear anything but the wind. "Riders," she whispered, her face pale. "A lot of them, and they're moving fast." He strained his ears and finally heard it, a low, distant thunder, the sound of a posse. "How did they find us so fast?" Caleb asked, his hand already on his Colt. "Whitmore has men," Elena said, her voice tight. "Men who can track a hawk's shadow across solid rock." She pointed to a jagged outcropping of boulders a half-mile away. "We need to get there, now." They spurred their horses, abandoning any attempt at hiding their trail. It was a race now. They reached the rocks just as the posse crested a nearby ridge. 8 riders. They weren't cowboys. They were hunters, professionals, armed with rifles and a cold, predatory focus. Caleb watched them through a gap in the rocks, his military training kicking in. He assessed their formation, their equipment, their leader. And then his blood ran cold. The man in the lead, a wiry man with a long, cruel scar down his face, was someone he knew. His name was Silas Kane. Caleb had served with him briefly before Kane was dishonorably discharged for torturing prisoners. He was a man who enjoyed inflicting pain, a man with no conscience and a deadly skill with a gun. Whitmore hadn't just hired a posse, he'd hired a killer. Silas Kane dismounted and studied the ground. his movements slow and deliberate. Even from this distance, Caleb could see the man's unnatural stillness, the way he read the story of their passage in the dirt. After a moment, Kane looked up, and his eyes seemed to lock directly onto their hiding place. He pointed. A cold smile spread across his scarred face. "He knows," Caleb said, his voice grim. "He knows we're here." The game had just changed. They weren't just being hunted anymore. They were being cornered by a monster. Elena looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with fear, but her jaw was set. She had made her choice. She would not be taken alive. Caleb checked his revolver, the familiar weight a small comfort. He had 6 shots. There were 8 of them. The odds weren't good, but Caleb Hart had faced worse odds before. "We don't fight them here," he said, his mind racing. "We make them come to us. We find ground of our own choosing." Elena nodded. "I know a place," she said. "An old mine. My grandfather used to take me there. It's a maze inside, and it has more than one way out." It was a gamble, but it was the only one they had. They mounted their horses and plunged deeper into the rocky maze, with the devil himself on their trail. The entrance to the abandoned mine was little more than a dark slit in the hillside, almost completely hidden by a thicket of juniper. They led their horses inside, the air immediately growing cool and damp, smelling of earth and old secrets. Just as they disappeared into the darkness, the sky opened up. A sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted, the rain coming down in sheets, washing away their tracks, giving them a precious gift of time. "God provides," Elena murmured, a small, grateful smile on her face. They made a small, smokeless fire deep inside the main chamber. For the first time in days, they were safe. The tension of the chase began to drain away, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. In the flickering firelight, the barriers between them started to crumble. They were no longer just rescuer and victim. They were 2 people, bound together by a shared danger and a desperate hope. "Tell me about your nightmares," Caleb said softly, breaking the silence. Elena flinched, her hand instinctively going to her throat, where her cross used to be. She told him about the fire, about the smell of burning wood and the sound of her parents' screams. She told him about the guilt that ate at her, the survivor's guilt that made her wonder if she'd been spared only to suffer a worse fate. Then he told her about his. He told her about a bridge near Richmond, a supply train full of medicine for a Union hospital. He'd followed his orders. He'd destroyed the bridge. He still saw the faces of the doctors and nurses in his dreams, heard the cries of the wounded men he'd condemned to death. "I was a good soldier," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I followed orders and lost my soul." Elena reached across the small fire and took his hand. "You did not lose it," she said, her voice firm. "You just forgot where to find it. Perhaps." She hesitated. "Perhaps we can help each other find what we have lost." Her words hung in the air, a fragile promise. He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, the fire that years of abuse had not been able to extinguish. He saw not a victim, but an equal, a partner. He leaned forward, drawn to her by a force stronger than reason. And in that moment, just as their world had shrunk to this small circle of firelight, Elena stiffened. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Someone's coming," she hissed. Caleb listened. At first nothing, then he heard it, the soft scrape of a boot on wet rock just outside the mine entrance, the quiet whinny of a horse. Silas Kane hadn't been fooled by the storm. He'd found them. They scrambled to their feet, kicking dirt over the fire, plunging the cavern into darkness. Voices echoed from the entrance. Kane's voice, cold and amused. "I know you're in there. Come on out. The Baron wants the girl alive. He didn't say anything about you." They were trapped, but Elena grabbed Caleb's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. This way, she breathed, pulling him toward a narrow, dark tunnel he hadn't noticed before. The mine has other doors. They plunged into the suffocating blackness, their hands trailing along the cold, damp rock wall. Behind them, they could hear Kane's men entering the main chamber, their lanterns casting dancing, monstrous shadows. The tunnel was tight, forcing them to crawl in some places. It felt like being buried alive. After what felt like an eternity, Elena stopped. "Up," she whispered. "There's a ventilation shaft here. It goes to the surface." Caleb reached up and felt a series of rough handholds carved into the rock. It was a treacherous climb, made worse by the absolute darkness and the sounds of their pursuers getting closer. But they climbed, driven by pure adrenaline. They emerged from a narrow fissure on the hillside, gasping in the cold, rain-soaked air. They were out. They were free. But when Caleb looked back toward the mine entrance, his heart sank. Their horses were gone. Kane's men had found them. They were alone, on foot, in the middle of a storm, with a dozen miles of rugged country between them and the next possible shelter. "Now what?" Caleb shouted over the wind. Elena wiped the rain from her face. In the flashes of lightning, she looked like a vengeful goddess, fierce and unbroken. "Now," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "We walk." As they started to move, Caleb noticed she was clutching something in her hand. A bent, rusty horseshoe nail he'd picked up at their last camp. He'd been idly twisting it, a nervous habit. He'd dropped it in the mine, and she had picked it up. He stopped her, taking the nail from her hand. With his strong fingers, he bent it into a crude circle. A ring. He held it out to her. "It's not much," he said, his voice rough. "But it's a promise. A promise that you will never be anyone's property again. That we face whatever comes next together, as equals." Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks as she held out her hand. He slipped the makeshift ring onto her finger. It was a vow made in a storm, a pledge between two fugitives. Behind them, angry shouts echoed from the mine as Kane realized his prey had vanished. Ahead of them lay a future they couldn't possibly imagine. But for the first time, they weren't running from something. They were walking toward it. Together. Walking through the storm was a special kind of hell. The mud pulled at their boots, the wind tore at their clothes, and the cold seeped into their bones. They moved for hours, fueled by a desperate, stubborn will to survive. Just before dawn, as the storm finally began to break, they found it. The line shack. It was a small, solid structure of adobe and wood, weathered by years of neglect but still standing. It had been an outpost on her family's land, a place her father had built with his own hands. "I helped him mix the mud for these walls," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion as she ran a hand over the rough surface. Inside, it was sparse but dry. There was a stone fireplace and, miraculously, a small stack of firewood left by some previous traveler. They stripped off their wet clothes and huddled together under a single, threadbare blanket in front of a newly kindled fire, sharing the last of their jerky. The warmth felt like a resurrection. They were alive. They had escaped. But they both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Kane would not give up. "He'll assume we died in the storm," Caleb said, trying to sound confident. "Or that we kept heading north." Elena shook her head. "A man like that does not assume. He will search. He will find this place." A new kind of despair began to settle over Caleb. They were out of options. They had no horses, no food, and a killer was on their trail. They had run as far as they could. But then, as she stared into the flames, a strange look came over Elena's face. A flicker of a memory, long buried. "My father," she said slowly. "He was a careful man. He knew men like Whitmore were circling. He told me he made copies of all our important papers. The land grants, the deeds. He said he hid them, as insurance against thieves and liars. Her eyes darted around the small room, then fixed on the stone fireplace. She scrambled to her feet and began running her hands over the stones beside the hearth. "He hid a set here," she whispered, her voice trembling with a new, frantic energy. "I remember helping him. There was a loose stone." Her fingers found it, a single stone that shifted under her touch. With Caleb's help, she pried it free. Behind it was a small, hollow space, and inside that space was a leather-wrapped bundle. Her hands shook as she untied the leather cord. This was it. The proof. The key to reclaiming her life, her legacy. This would change everything. But when she opened the bundle, her face fell. It wasn't a stack of legal documents. It was a single object. A daguerreotype. A formal family portrait. Her mother, her father, her brothers, and a 14-year-old Elena, all staring out from the past. A wave of crushing disappointment washed over her. "It's just a photograph," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. All hope vanished. Caleb took the photograph from her trembling hands, ready to offer some useless words of comfort. But as he looked at it, his soldier's eye for detail caught something. It wasn't the people he was looking at. It was the building in the background, a grand columned building of cut stone. "Elena," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, "where was this picture taken?" She looked at it again, her eyes clouded with grief. I don't remember. San Antonio, I think. We went there on business just before the fire." "The courthouse," Caleb breathed, a wild, impossible idea blooming in his mind. "That's the territorial courthouse in San Antonio." Elena stared at him, not understanding. "Your father wasn't hiding the documents here," Caleb explained, his voice electric with excitement. "This was just a reminder, a clue. He was a smart man, Elena. He didn't hide the proof in a wall where it could be found or destroyed in a fire. He hid it in plain sight. He filed official copies with the territorial government." The air in the small shack crackled. The world shifted on its axis. All this time, they had been running away, trying to get to the safety of Colorado. But safety wasn't north. Justice was south. "We're not running anymore," Caleb said, his eyes locking with hers. "We're going to San Antonio. We're going to get those papers, and we're going to destroy Baron Whitmore." The fear in Elena's eyes was replaced by a fire he hadn't seen before. The fire of a woman who had just been handed a sword. She was no longer a victim. She was an heir, on her way to reclaim her throne. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. The journey to San Antonio was a desperate gamble. They were traveling on foot, through territory controlled by their enemy. Every traveler they saw on the road was a potential threat, every distant plume of dust a sign of approaching danger. Whitmore had put a price on Elena's head. $2,000. A king's ransom. Enough to make an honest man turn traitor, and a dishonest man turn killer. They traveled by night and hid during the day, stealing food from farmsteads and drinking from cattle troughs. Elena, dressed in a boy's clothes they'd found in the line shack, cut her hair short with Caleb's knife. The transformation was startling. The haunted woman was gone, replaced by a grim, determined youth with fire in her eyes. Caleb taught her how to use a gun, how to move without making a sound, how to read the signs of an ambush. She was a natural, her instincts honed by years of survival. They were no longer protector and protected. They were a team, a two-person army on a mission. On the fourth night, as they neared the city, they saw the glow of a campfire. Caleb motioned for them to take cover. He crept forward, his Colt drawn. 3 men were sitting around the fire. Bounty hunters. He could tell by their hard faces and the way they wore their guns. They were talking about the reward, about the Mexican girl and the ex-Reb who was with her. One of them laughed. $2,000 is a lot of money, he said. But Kane's boys are out here too. They ain't looking to bring her back alive. They got orders to put her and the soldier in the ground. The blood ran cold in Caleb's veins. Whitmore wasn't just trying to get his property back. He was trying to bury a secret. He wanted Elena dead. He crept back to Elena and told her what he'd heard. She didn't flinch. Her hand went to the pistol tucked into her belt. "Then we must get to the courthouse before they get to us," she said, her voice steady. They finally reached San Antonio, a sprawling city of adobe and stone, a place of saints and sinners. Elena knew of a distant relative, an old woman named Tia Esperanza who lived in the Mexican Quarter. It was a risk, but they had no other choice. They found the small, neat house at the end of a dusty street. When Esperanza opened the door, her eyes widened in shock, then in fear. "Elena? By the saints, they said you were dead." "Not dead, Tia," Elena said, "just waiting." Esperanza pulled them inside, her eyes darting nervously up and down the street. "You are fools to be here. Whitmore's men are everywhere. The bounty hunters are like vultures. They will tear you apart." But when Elena showed her the daguerreotype and told her their plan, the fear in the old woman's eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Hope. "Your father was a good man," Esperanza said, her voice trembling. "He deserved justice." She agreed to help. She told them of a young clerk at the courthouse, Diego Morales, whose family had once been loyal to the Ramirezes. She also told them about Judge Marcus Webb, a new judge, an outsider, a man who, it was whispered, could not be bought. He was also, by a stroke of fate, an old friend of Caleb's from the war. A man who owed Caleb his life. The plan was set. At dawn, they would go to the courthouse. Elena would approach Diego, while Caleb went to see the judge. They had one day to find the proof and convince the law to act before the killers found them. As they prepared for the morning, Elena took Caleb's hand. On her finger, the crude ring made from a horseshoe nail looked strangely elegant. "Tomorrow," she said, "we either win our freedom or we die trying." Caleb looked at the woman beside him, a woman who had been through hell and had come out forged in its fires. "Together," he said. It was the only word that mattered. Dawn in San Antonio broke hot and tense. The city was a powder keg, and they were the spark. Dressed in her disguise, Elena slipped into the courthouse through a side door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found the clerk, Diego, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers and fearful eyes. When she told him who she was, he almost fainted. "They will kill me for helping you," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Elena placed the last of her grandmother's jewelry on the desk between them. "My aunt says your mother is sick," she said softly. "This can buy her medicine. It can buy her life." But it wasn't the jewelry that convinced him. It was the look in her eyes, the same look of desperate hope he'd seen in his own father's eyes before men like Whitmore had crushed him. He nodded, his hands trembling. "Quickly," he said, "before anyone sees." He led her down to the dusty, cavernous archives in the basement. It was a maze of forgotten stories and buried secrets. After a frantic search, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. Ramirez, 1863. Elena's hands shook as she opened it. And there it was, page after page of her father's meticulous handwriting, the original Mexican land grant, territorial surveys, tax receipts, and at the very back, the most damning document of all, a formal, notarized complaint filed by her father against Baron Whitmore, detailing his crimes of fraud, intimidation, and violence. It had been officially received by the territorial governor's office and then buried. "He knew," Elena whispered, tears of rage and vindication streaming down her face. "He fought back. They just ignored him." Meanwhile, Caleb was on the second floor, standing in the office of Judge Marcus Webb. The man behind the desk was older, wearier, and missing his left arm, a souvenir from the day Caleb had pulled him from a collapsed trench in Vicksburg. "Caleb," Webb said, a slow, sad smile on his face. "Of all the gin joints in all the world." "It's not a social call, Marcus," Caleb said, getting straight to the point. He told him everything. Webb listened, his face a grim, unreadable mask. When Caleb was finished, the judge sighed, a long, heavy sound. "You're asking me to go to war with one of the most powerful men in Texas, Caleb, based on the word of a runaway servant." "She's not a servant," a voice said from the doorway. Elena stood there, holding the ledger, her boyish disguise doing little to hide the fierce dignity that burned in her eyes. "She's an heiress, and this," she said, placing the heavy book on the judge's desk, "is the proof." Judge Webb spent the next hour reading. The silence in the room was absolute. The deeper he read, the darker his face became. When he finally looked up, his eyes were troubled. "This is explosive," he admitted. "But it's not enough. Whitmore will claim they're forgeries. He'll bribe witnesses. He owns the system, Caleb. These papers alone won't convict him. He'll bury you in legal motions until you run out of money and hope." "So you won't help us?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously low. "I'm telling you to be smart," Webb shot back, his frustration boiling over. "Take the girl, go to Colorado, and live your life. You can't win this fight." But Elena stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "My family is dead, Your Honor. My home is gone. My name was stolen from me. I have nothing left to lose. But you took an oath to uphold the law, to serve justice. Or was that just words?" Her words hit Webb harder than any bullet. He looked at his empty sleeve, a reminder of a time when he'd believed in causes, in right and wrong. He looked at the determined woman in front of him, and the cynical, pragmatic politician he had become, felt a flicker of the idealistic young man he used to be. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "But we do this my way. There's only one path. You must file a formal accusation, in open court. You must stand before the whole territory and tell your story. It will force an investigation. It will put you under the protection of the court." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "But know this, Miss Ramirez. Once you step into that courtroom, you are putting a target on your back. Whitmore will not stop until you are silenced. Permanently." Elena looked at Caleb, who gave her a single, sharp nod. She then turned back to the judge. "He has been trying to silence me for 4 years," she said, her voice ringing like steel. "Let him try." The decision was made, the battle lines were drawn, and outside the courthouse, in the sun-drenched plaza, Silas Kane and his men were getting closer. They had picked up the trail. The news that Elena Ramirez was alive and had formally accused Baron Whitmore of murder and fraud spread through San Antonio like wildfire. The city, which had been a hunting ground, was now a courtroom. Judge Webb, true to his word, placed Elena under the official protection of the court, lodging her in a guarded room at the finest hotel. But everyone knew the flimsy protection of the law was no match for a determined killer. Silas Kane and his men didn't leave town. They lingered, their presence a constant, silent threat. Whitmore himself arrived a week later, not in chains, but with a team of high-priced lawyers from Austin. He was arrogant, untouchable, treating the entire proceeding as an inconvenience. He publicly decried Elena as a delusional, ungrateful servant, manipulated by a bitter ex-Confederate. The town was divided. The powerful sided with Whitmore. The poor, the disenfranchised, the other families who had been bullied and cheated by men like him, silently prayed for Elena. The trial became the biggest spectacle in the history of the Texas territory. For 2 weeks, Whitmore's lawyers painted Elena as a liar, a thief, a woman of loose morals. They tore into Caleb's war record, portraying him as a violent, unstable drifter. It was a brutal, relentless assault on their characters. Through it all, Caleb and Elena stood firm. They had one weapon Whitmore couldn't buy or bully: the truth. When Elena finally took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was no longer disguised as a boy. She wore a simple, dignified dress, a gift from Tia Esperanza and the other women of the quarter. She told her story, not with tears or hysterics, but with a quiet, powerful rage that held the entire room captive. She spoke of her family, of the fire, of the years of terror and humiliation. She laid her father's ledger on the witness stand, its pages a testament to a crime that had gone unpunished for too long. Whitmore watched her, a smug, contemptuous smile on his face. He believed he was invincible. That was his second mistake. The final witness was a surprise to everyone, including Caleb and Elena. Judge Webb called a man to the stand named Thomas Rodriguez, a frail, elderly man who had been a foreman on the Ramirez ranch for 30 years. He had disappeared after the fire, presumed dead. But he had been hiding, living in fear for 4 years. Now, inspired by Elena's courage, he had come forward. He told the jury what he saw on the night of the fire. He described seeing Whitmore and 2 of his men riding away from the burning ranch house, their faces illuminated by the flames. He had heard Whitmore laugh and say, "That's the last time a Mexican farmer will question my boundaries." It was the nail in the coffin. The jury, made up of simple ranchers and merchants who understood land and honor, deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was guilty, on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Baron Whitmore, the untouchable land king, was sentenced to hang. Justice, it turned out, wasn't dead in Texas. It had just been sleeping. In the chaotic aftermath, as Whitmore was being led away in chains, shouting threats and curses, Caleb saw Silas Kane slip out the back of the courtroom. The law had dealt with Whitmore. But Kane was a different kind of problem, a problem that required a different kind of justice. If you've been moved by Elena's fight for justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and you won't want to miss the stories we have coming up. That night, Caleb found Kane in a cantina at the edge of town. The bounty hunter was drinking alone, his face dark with fury. "The job's over, Kane," Caleb said, his voice low and even. "Time for you to leave Texas." Kane looked up, and the cold, dead smile returned to his face. "The job's not over until I get paid," he snarled. "And I always get paid." He went for his gun. But Caleb was faster. His draw was a blur of motion, a testament to years of training and a lifetime of violence. The shot was deafening in the small room. Kane slumped over the table, his dead eyes staring into his whiskey glass. Caleb didn't wait for the sheriff. He walked out of the cantina and back to the hotel. His war was finally over. He had balanced the scales. 6 months later, Elena and Caleb stood on a hill overlooking a beautiful valley in Colorado. The Double Eagle Ranch, Caleb's inheritance, was thriving. They had used the money from the sale of the reclaimed Ramirez Ranch, which Elena had sold to a cooperative of other families displaced by Whitmore, to build a new life. They were married now, their vows spoken not in a storm, but under a wide, peaceful sky. Elena held a letter in her hand, the paper crinkling in the breeze. "It's from Judge Webb," she said. "He says the territorial governor has issued you a full pardon for your actions during the war. He said your service to the cause of justice in Texas has more than redeemed any past transgressions." Caleb felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. He was no longer a ghost. He was a husband, a rancher, a man at peace. Elena leaned her head on his shoulder, the crude, bent nail ring still on her finger, right next to a simple gold band. "We did it, Caleb," she whispered. "We got justice." Caleb looked out at their land, at the mountains that stood like sentinels against the sky. "No," he said, pulling her close. "We did better than that." we built a home. Two broken souls, lost in the wilderness of post-war America, had found more than just redemption. They had found each other. And in a world full of ghosts and monsters, that was the only kind of justice that truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Thanks for watching.